Okay, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the second part in the World Beyond War Ireland webinar series. My name is Greta Zaro. I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War. A few Zoom logistics before we get started. We are recording today's webinar, so we will send out the recording afterwards to all registrants. And if you have to leave during the webinar, don't worry, because you'll get that recording afterwards. Today we'll be using the chat box for putting your questions and comments, so please do that throughout the event. We also have captioning on. If you need closed captions, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enable closed captioning. It is done by robots, so please excuse any errors. And you can also click the button to disable the captions if you don't want to view them. Yeah, and with that, I will pass it over to Miriam to introduce today's event.
Okay, Greta. You're all very welcome to the Irish chapter of World Beyond War. And you know, it's said that the first casualty of war is truth. So if war can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. So this evening, our host, Brian Sheridan, will be in conversation with Lara Marlowe. And our respondent will be Ian Atack, kindly standing in for Joe Murray. Now, Brian is a farmer and a peace activist with the Irish chapter of World Beyond War. And Lara Marlowe, a renowned journalist and currently the Paris correspondent with the Irish Times. She was a war correspondent and recently published a marvelous epic book called Love in a Time of War. And it's there's stunning beauty in it, and there's cruel reality in it. So Ian Atack is recently retired from Trinity College, and he was a lecturer on the International Peace Studies. He's a board member of AFRI, which is a peace and social justice organisation based in Dublin, but it has worldwide reach. And Ian is currently coordinator of STOP, which is Swords to Plowshares Peace Movement. So there will be an opportunity, as Greta said, for questions at the end using the chat button. And this is hosted by Caroline Hurley, a member of Irish chapter of World Beyond War. So welcome to you all, and over to Brian.
Good evening, Lara, and thank you very much for joining us. You're muted, Lara. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. Lara, context is everything. So could you just give us a little context of Lara Marlowe, your parents, your grandparents, growing up in California, and the influences and the influencers on your young life?
Well, like most Americans, I'm just a sort of soup of various European nationalities, French, Swiss, German, probably Irish. I had one great grandmother who was called Callie Herney, which sounds like an Irish name to me. My father died when I was very, very small. I was 2 years old, and my mother raised her 4 children alone. She was a school teacher. She freaked out completely when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And I think perhaps my absolute hatred of wars, I could probably trace back to that. I was 5 years old. And my mother was recently widowed with 4 children, and she wanted to take us to Chile to live because she thought that the radiation wouldn't get to Chile. But my half-brother's father would not sign the papers for him to leave the country. So instead, she built a bomb shelter in the back garden. And it was like, we used to play submarine and airplane in the bomb shelter, but we would hear my mother telling us about radiation sickness, and she was stocking up tin food in the bomb shelter and so on. So that's one of my earliest memories in life. And it was very, very sobering. I remember I covered in 1997 the signing of the founding act between NATO and Russia, which is very pertinent today because NATO somehow forgot that it committed not to extend to Eastern Europe, to countries from this former Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And they violated this. And this is not to justify what Vladimir Putin is doing, but it really was a double cross. But anyway, at that ceremony at the Élysée in 1997, I found it extremely moving because I think it was Tony Blair, who's not actually my cup of tea, but Tony Blair said, no one will ever threaten anyone with nuclear weapons again. It's over. The Cold War is over. We won't have a nuclear war. And because of my childhood memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I found that very, very moving indeed. What else can I tell you? I went to school. I was educated actually by Protestant fundamentalists, which gave me also not only a distaste for war, but a distaste for organized religion. Forgive me if I'm offending anyone. I became a French major when I went to university. I was obsessed with France from a very early age. I think it was because my mother went to Europe and the Middle East with her church group and came back with souvenirs. And there were a lot of souvenirs from Paris. There was a little bronze Eiffel Tower and a scarf with monuments of Paris and so on. And I think she must have said to me, oh, Lara, you would love Paris, because from that age on, I became obsessed with it. And I only wanted to learn French. And so when I was 19, I came to Paris for the first time as a student abroad. Learned French, became a journalist, met Robert Fisk, moved to Beirut, and then all the rest is history. I've covered about 15 wars, I think. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Would you like to paint some words for us? Your life in Beirut and the different groups that were killing each other and your experiences there in Beirut. If you could like to pick out any of them and say a few.
Well, I lived in Beirut from 1988 until 1996, and I did continue to go back for a long time after that. I think probably the two most salient memories I have would be the Aoun War, when General Aoun, who is now actually the president of Lebanon, which seems outrageous. I think he should be in prison as a war criminal. General Aoun decided that he would, between quotation marks, liberate Lebanon from the Syrian occupation. And I think that the Syrians probably should have left Lebanon a long time before they did, but this was not the way to do it. He started shelling West Beirut, and he shelled West Beirut every night for 6 months. So that was my introduction to life in Lebanon. There were also car bombs and snipers and other things going on, but there was one particular night that I remembered that I described in my memoir, when he was trying to destroy or we didn't really know what was going on. We thought maybe he was going to do a landing because we were on the seafront. They just shelled all night very, very hard, and we actually fled down to the ground floor. The noise was horrendous. The building was shaking, and around 2 or 3 in the morning, the gate rattled, and there were some Syrian soldiers with a wounded comrade. And his shirt was sort of torn open. He was bleeding from the chest, and they brought him in. He was clearly in shock. And we were there by candlelight because there was no electricity, of course. And he was slumped over, and we just stayed there for hours with this wounded soldier. The landlord and his family were with us, and Mustafa made tea on one of those little gas cookers. And at dawn, the shelling subsided, and the soldiers came back and took their comrade away. And Mustafa told them, "You must take him to a hospital." I don't know if he survived. I hope he did, certainly. That was one really powerful memory. And another one that comes to, well, actually 2 other very, very strong memories from those 8 years in Lebanon. The assassination of Rafiq Hariri in 2005. Actually, I wasn't living in Beirut anymore by then, but he was a good friend, and he, despite, he corrupted people, and he was a billionaire, and he was far from perfect, but I think he really had Lebanon's interest at heart, and he was trying to rebuild the country. And he was assassinated along with 21 other people. His motorcade there was a massive sort of truck bomb detonated just in front of him. it was a terrible, terrible shock to lose someone who you knew that well. And the last, the most powerful of all was the Khana Massacre, which was on April 18th of 1996. There was an Israeli assault against southern Lebanon going on. That was something that happened every few years. And it was basically a war between Hezbollah and the Israelis. We had gone to Tibnin, where the Irish battalion was headquartered, and we'd spent the morning there, and we were coming back. It was just after 2 in the afternoon in a UN vehicle, and we heard a lot of explosions. And actually, the Israeli artillery shells, most of them proximity shells, which basically cut people into mincemeat. Forgive me for putting it so graphically, but that's what they do. They were going over our heads, over the vehicle that we were in, and we heard a Lebanese army officer on the radio come on the radio saying they're shelling Fiji Bat headquarters. Make them stop it. Make them stop. He was on the radio to Nakura, to UNIFIL headquarters. And the bombardment lasted for 17 minutes. We got to the gates of the Fiji Battalion headquarters, and there was literally blood flowing down the hillside. It was a river of blood flowing down the hillside. And we went inside, and the compound was on fire. There had been 106 Lebanese civilians killed in this 17-minute bombardment. And I can't even begin to tell you how horrific it was. Just pieces of people and dead bodies everywhere and burned bodies. And it was the worst thing I ever saw in my life in 15 years of, God, I don't know how many years of war, but in all the wars that I covered, it was certainly the very worst thing I ever saw. And if someone had been punished, if there had been some kind of justice afterwards, I think it wouldn't have erased it, obviously, but it would not have been so bad. But nobody was ever punished for it. A NATO general, Frederick van Kappen, a Dutch general, did a report which the Americans did not want published. They sacked Boutros Ghali for publishing it. And the only reason that he published it was because Robert Fisk, who I was married to at the time, got a video of an Israeli drone overhead while the attack was going on. In other words, they could see what they were doing. And that created a big scandal, and it forced the UN to publish the Van Kappen report. And Boutros Ghali later told us that the Americans got him sacked for having published that report. But the Khana Massacre is something that really stayed with me, that I will never, ever forget until I die. And it's something that makes me really angry, that so many people suffered so horribly. There was one man called Sadallah Balhas who lost 33 relatives, including his wife, his children, his grandchildren. And he was just a farmer. And he survived, amazingly enough. And when I saw him in the hospital in Tyre, and he said, I remember you from 1993, 3 years before. There'd been a similar Israeli offensive, and he had his leg smashed by an artillery shell, and he was in the hospital. And I hadn't remembered him, because you see so many wounded people in hospitals, but he remembered me, and he said, my wife was standing beside me then, and she died in Khana. So those would be my most powerful memories of Lebanon. There are thousands of others, but that's probably enough for now.
Right. The other thing we remember about Lebanon is the kidnapping, and we only remember about the Westerners that were kidnapped. But in your book, you mentioned that there are many, many Lebanese people kidnapped during that time.
Thousands. I would have to check the figure, but I think the Lebanese Cross told me it was something like 17,000 Lebanese. Many of them not only never seen again, but no remains ever found, and their families lived in total uncertainty for the rest of their lives, always hoping against hope that the relative would come home. It was a very tragic thing, and it was basically you were targeted because of your religion. Right, there was what they called Black Saturday in Lebanon right after the war started, when, as revenge for some kind of attack or a murder, I can't remember, but you can always follow these things back and back and back. The phalangist set up a checkpoint on the ring road and started stopping cars, and anyone the Lebanese identity papers show your religion. So if your card said you were a Muslim, or if your name was Mustafa or Mohammed, or it's very easy to tell who's a Muslim or a Christian in Lebanon. They slashed their throats, all the men, and let the women and girls, and children go. But and then the Muslims realized what was happening, and they did the same thing. And something like 300 people died in just one day. The kidnapping was the same principle. Basically, you'd get stopped at a checkpoint, and if you were in the wrong part of Beirut and you were the wrong religion, they'd lock you up. And many of them were held for ransom. They were held as bargaining chips to get back fighters very often. But it was a very, very cruel, horrible thing, because when you take someone a hostage, you take their whole family hostage with them, in a sense.
Well, thank you. We hear very frequently, that the missiles and the weapons, it's exactly pinpoint accuracy. With all this technology has developed so much, there's pinpoint accuracy. But I'm sure you would have something to say on what you witnessed of pinpoint accuracy.
I think pinpoint accuracy is a myth. I mean, this started in the 1991 Iraq war, when the Americans started showing all those videos, and you would, it was as if you were in the cockpit with the pilot, and you would see the bomb going down. There were black and white images usually, and you'd see it. Sometimes it would go down a chimney or a funnel, or this sort of thing, and then you'd see the explosion. And so we were meant to believe that only military targets were hit. There was a state auditor in the U.S., the National Accounting Office, the National Government Accounting Office, the GAO. Yes, that's it. Did a report, and they said that actually only 8% of the weapons used in that war were so-called smart bombs. But it depends on what if you fire the smart bomb at a human apartment building, you still kill humans, no matter how smart the bomb is. The Israelis do this all the time, and if they figure that if they get one Hamas guy, they don't care if they kill 18 or 20 or 30 other people with him. And that's, one of the worst atrocities of the 1991 war was the Amaria shelter in Baghdad, when the Americans bombed, and they were probably bombing it with smart weapons, but what they said was a military shelter. In fact, it was virtually all women and children, and about 400 people were in that shelter and died. And it was horrific. I mean, the hands were sort of glued to the ceiling and the walls. It was just inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. So I'm against all weapons, whether they're smart or stupid. It's all the same to me.
And it is around this time you were reporting for Time, and could you tell us about why you resigned from Time magazine? Actually,
it was the reason I resigned was the Khana Massacre that I told you about. They were afraid of the truth. I mean, this wasn't the first time I'd had problems with them. Over the years, I was covering the Arab world, and most of my editors in New York were very pro-Israeli. And it put me in a very difficult position, because my editors were very keen to run stories about human rights abuses and torture in Arab countries. But when Israel was running the Qiyam prison in southern Lebanon, where they were torturing people, where they were teaching the South Lebanon army, their proxy militia, how to torture people, my editors didn't want to hear about it. And what happened at the time of the Khana Massacre was, I had an eyewitness account, And it was published across the bottom of 2 pages, what they call the basement in magazine journalism, and I had to fight very, very hard to protect the integrity of my reporting. There was an editor in New York who wouldn't even put the true casualty figure, which in the end was 106 dead. She had it as 76 for it happened on Thursday, and in the middle of the night from Saturday to Sunday, when we were putting the magazine to bed, it was still 76. And so finally I rang her and I said, Johanna, why aren't you correcting the casualty figure? And she said, well, we always use the most conservative estimate. And I said, what do you mean estimate? It's official, it's over 100 dead. And she said, well, that's what the Associated Press said on Thursday. And I said, yes, but that was 2 or 3 days ago. You know, they've counted the bodies now. And she said, no, I'll just leave it the way it is. And so I had to go above her head to the editor of the international edition. He said, I'm not going to get involved in a row between a correspondent and an editor. And I said, Joe, if you don't believe me, here is the phone number of Captain Mike Linval at Unifil. You call him, he will tell you officially it is over 100 dead. This was the kind of battle that I was fighting all the time. And then when the magazine came to Beirut, when it was on the newsstands on Monday morning, I rushed, of course, to see what had happened with my story. And my story was intact, and they hadn't messed with it anymore, which was a relief. But there was a photograph of a dead child in the morgue in Tyre. And the caption of the photo was, "A child killed in the crossfire at Khana." There was no crossfire at Khana. It was a one-way Israeli bombardment that killed all these people. And I was just sickened by that. And then the battle went on over the Van Kappen report. It dragged on and on. I just thought, I don't want to risk my life for this magazine anymore. So that's when I started looking for another job. And fortunately, I found a position at Time magazine soon after.
Okay, lovely, great. Thanks very much for that. And why do you think that Israel has such power over the media and over the UN and over America, if you could say briefly? They seem to have phenomenal power for their side of the story.
I would agree with that. I think there are 2 main reasons. One is they fight their corner very well. I wish that, for example, the Palestinians had some of the media savvy, the ability to argue, to pursue things. If you criticize the Israelis, or even more so, if you reveal atrocities they've committed, they make your life hell. I have had several complaints. Certainly, I know from after I covered the 2009 offensive in Gaza, the Israeli embassy complained to the press council in Ireland. I think there were other times as well, but that's the time I really remember. And they waited several months after I'd been in Gaza so that I had filed all my notebooks in the cellar and, filed all my clippings and everything. And they waited until it was no longer really fresh in my mind. And then they come out with, they basically question every word of every line of every story, and they dispute it. And then you've got to go back and justify everything you reported. And I'm very organized. I have good notes and I know the source of everything I report. And so I did it, but it ate up days and days of my time. And this becomes such a nuisance that journalists they know that if they write something, they're going to get caught up in this endless, justification of what they've written, and they just don't want to take it on. That's one reason. Another reason they have great power is that they have great money. They have a huge amount of money, and they finance. There's an outfit called AIPAC, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The American Israel. What does the P stand for? Anyway, it's AIPAC is the famous or infamous Israeli lobby. And one is accused of being anti-Semitic if one merely says the words Israeli lobby. But AIPAC gives massive amounts of money to political campaigns. And they not only do that, if there's a congressman or a senator who dares to vote against Israel on a bill, they make sure that person is not reelected. And it's happened repeatedly. in the US. There was a book, somebody has to help me remember the names of the authors. I could find it very quickly. I think there were two Harvard academics called the Israeli Lobby, and this was about 10 years ago, maybe more, which documented this in very great detail. Unfortunately, you know, the Arabs, who also have a lot of money, never got their act together, and they'd rather fight each other. The Gulf Arabs hate the Palestinians since the invasion of Kuwait. Everyone has basically abandoned the Palestinians. It's a miserable situation.
Thank you. Would you like to go across the Mediterranean now to the Algerian civil war, and perhaps we'll come back to Europe again and have to talk about Iraq as well before we let you go. So we've a lot, whichever of them you'd like to go to.
Algeria is, I mean, sadly, all of these countries that I worked in, there's not one that is doing well. I'm very, very sorry to say. Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Algeria, former Yugoslavia, all the countries which I discussed in my book. I see a comment. Authors of the Israeli Lobby book are John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Thank you, Caroline Hurley. That's, oh, sorry, they can see it too. I'm kind of inexperienced at Zoom and all of this, so forgive my poor manners here. Yeah, Algeria. I loved Algeria because it was so Frenchified, like me. I really liked working there. I thought Algiers is a beautiful city, but what a horrendous, really, really grim conflict, really barbaric. And it was all Algerians killing Algerians. It was a civil war. It started in 1991 because the military regime had promised free and fair elections for the first time since Algerian independence. And the Islamic Salvation Front, which is known by FIS, it's French, Front Islamique de Salut, was going to win those elections. They won massively in the first round, and they were going to win the second round. So the generals stepped in and aborted the elections, stopped the elections, and then drove the Islamists underground. And then the Islamists started doing bombings and assassinations, and the government was doing bombings and assassinations, and everybody, it got to the point where no one knew who was doing what. Qui tue qui, that was the slogan, which was popularized by a newspaper columnist, a wonderful man called Said Mekbel, who was himself murdered in a pizzeria at lunchtime. So it was an utter, total tragedy, and also just really hair-raising. I mean, schoolgirls, there was a young woman who was engaged to be married, and she was a secretary in the Police Welfare Association. And she was followed home and murdered because she worked for the police, and she was shot in the head when she got off the bus. And I went and talked to her family, and there was another young girl who was actually in school, and the armed Islamic group, the GIA, came and stabbed her in the face and neck and murdered her in front of her schoolmates. And those are the cases we know about, but there were whole villages wiped out. There were two villages called Rais and Bentaha in 1997, where men came in, and again, there was a lot of knives and axes and those kinds of weapons. And I mean, not that it's any better to be shot to death, but it somehow, one finds this really, I don't know. There's a famous photograph which I have in my book called the Madonna of Bentaha, who was a woman weeping over the victims of that. And for me, that kind of summarized that whole terrible, terrible decade in Algeria. And at the end, there were up to 200,000 people killed in about 10 years. And again, nobody was really punished. There was a general amnesty for both the government, the military, and the Islamists. And the country just kind of staggered on. The military is still in power. It's still not a democracy. And there was a beginning of sort of popular demonstrations and a movement just before the COVID pandemic started. And then I think the pandemic kind of put an end to it. And it's just still the same situation of a corrupt country and unjust rulers and very little hope, and young people want to leave. They come to Europe. They're crossing the Mediterranean whenever they can. So that's the sad story of Algeria.
Just before our time is ticking away, I'd really like to hear your experience in Iraq, but that's more recent. And I remember reading in your book, particularly when you went to visit some hospitals and there was no power, and the things you saw and the people you saw, and the interview you had with the young soldier who was clearing the way down into Baghdad. If you have any memories of those times.
Of the hospitals, what I remember about the hospitals is an investigation that Robert and I did into the effects of depleted uranium weapons. And they were used very, very widely in the 1991 Gulf War. They were used in Kuwait and sorry, I'm reading I see the questions at the bottom of the screen. It's sort of distracting. The depleted uranium weapons, I mean, the Americans claimed that they didn't cause cancer, and then they used them again in Kosovo in 1999. And I think they used them in Bosnia as well, if my memory is correct. And yet there was just this incredible explosion of cancer, and sort of, I think it was around 1996 or so, we were in Baghdad because there were repeated, even between the two wars, the 91 war and the 2003 war, there was a horrific sanctions regime that Madeleine Albright, actually I think it was the UN said caused the deaths of 500,000 children, and Madeleine Albright, who was then Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, said she thought it was worth it. The idea was that the sanctions would get rid of Saddam Hussein. But I'm wandering here. Going back to the depleted uranium, we were at the home of some Iraqi friends one day, and there was another guest there who was a woman of maybe 60 who was wearing a turban because she had lost all her hair because she'd done chemotherapy, and she had cancer, and I think just about everyone in her family had cancer. And these ladies started telling us all the people they knew who had cancer. It was just astonishing. It was a huge number of people. And so we started going around to the hospitals. We went to hospitals in Baghdad and also in Basra in southern Iraq, which was closer to the battlefield. And what was the most heartbreaking thing, but perhaps they were more vulnerable to it, was the number of children who had leukemia and other forms of cancer. A lot of adults had cancer too. And to see these kids with their bald heads and some of them just so listless lying in these hospital beds was utterly heartbreaking. And actually Robert, for the only time I ever knew him to do it, really, I say, crossed the line between just journalism and actively trying to do something. He raised over £200,000 through a campaign that he did with his newspaper to buy cancer drugs for these children, because not only did they get cancer because the Americans were so lavishly spreading depleted uranium around Iraq, once they got cancer, they couldn't be treated, and leukemia is in children can be cured quite easily with drugs, but they didn't have the drugs. And so Robert and Margaret Hassan, the Irish woman who was head of Save the Children in Baghdad, and who was later assassinated by one of the jihadist groups, they got the medicines into Iraq and probably saved a few children's lives. But that's what I remember about hospitals. I also remember hospitals at the end of towards the end of the 2003 war. Well, the end, I don't know, because the war went on for years and years actually, but the end of the first part of the war, when Saddam Hussein was overthrown, you, as a journalist, you always go to hospitals, because that's in a war, that's where you see the effects, you see what's happening, you get a real sense of who's winning, who's losing, how bad things are. And there, I remember too, yes, I remember seeing soldiers in the hospital, but the hospital I remember was actually, I think it was called the Saddam, no, it was named after Saddam's uncle. Anyway, it doesn't matter the name of the hospital. It was the last day of Saddam's rule. The day the regime fell, and we went to this hospital, and there was a heroic hospital director keeping it going. But Robert said when we walked in, it's the Crimean War. I mean, the entry, there was this large marble ground floor of the hospital that had been the sort of reception area, waiting room, that sort of thing. And there were bodies lying down, I mean, still living people, just packed wall to wall on the floor, in bandages, bleeding, crying. It was really a scene from hell. There was one guy on a trolley who was covered in burn cream, and I actually saw him die. He kind of lurched forward and fell backwards, and he was dead. And there was, up in the wards, the Americans were actually shelling the hospital because the Iraqis had parked artillery pieces in the oleander bushes around the hospital. And so every time an artillery shell would explode outside, you would hear people screaming. You know, these poor people were wounded already in hospital, and then they're still terrorized by more artillery shells. So that's another scene that I will never, ever forget as long as I live.
Lara, after all you're telling us, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty person?
Am I a pessimist or an optimist?
Yes.
I hate to say, I think my nature is pessimistic, and I've seen such terrible things. I've learned to appreciate my own good fortune. I think that we are incredibly fortunate to live in developed countries where when you flick a light switch, the light comes on, where you have a refrigerator to preserve your food, where you can sleep at night without being woken by bombardments, where you don't fear being kidnapped when you take the metro or walk out into the street, where for all of their shortcomings, the people you vote for basically do their job. I think that we are just incredibly lucky, and the most people in the world don't have those things that we have. But I've also seen the very worst of human nature. I mean, war brings out the good in people, in that I've often seen people sacrifice themselves, people risk their own lives to save others. But unfortunately, the weapons and the bad guys, as Robert always called them, just have a much greater capacity for harm. And I think of that line in Yates about there's more suffering in the world than you will ever know. And you have to sometimes even try to block it out. Otherwise, you can't go on. If you dwell on that all day, every day, it'll destroy you.
I just have another few very short questions. I can't let you go without asking them to you, Lara. Lara, if we call the war a war machine, what are the main cogs in that machine, and how can Joe Bloggs sort of interrupt that machine, in your opinion?
The arms industry is number one. I'm glad that Ireland doesn't produce any weapons, although I know CRH was selling cement to the Israelis for the wall, and again in the West Bank. I don't know how that ended, but that was not pleasing. But no, the arms manufacturers and the governments who flog these weapons. I mean, to my shame, France, which is my adopted country, I think they're second or third in the world in terms of arms exports, and arms exports have shot up under Emmanuel Macron. And I think this is reprehensible, and I don't want my money being used to research, develop, produce, sell weapons that kill people, because I've seen what these weapons do. So that's a big cog. The defense ministries, which are also, I mean, it's a sort of interwoven network between the governments, the arms industry, the defense ministries, private industry. Some of the arms companies are semi-public, and then lobbies, like we talked about the Israeli lobby, but there are other lobbies as well. The Saudis, remember after 9/11, the Saudis got almost all their citizens out of the US unscathed, all the members of the royal family anyway, because they have connections, and so there's all this sort of influence and
we could stay all night here talking. We really could. If we had enough money, World Beyond War, and were to put 3 billboards in O'Connell Street to promote peace and conflict, what would you say on each billboard to the Irish people?
Well, you see, the Irish are among the best. I mean, Ireland doesn't invade other countries. You haven't, you've made a huge contribution to UN peacekeeping. I've met Irish people I remember there's an Irish officer who just died called Pierce McCorley, who I knew in Bosnia and Croatia, who was with he was with the UN. He was in UNIFIL in southern Lebanon. He passed away just a week, 10 days ago. A really good guy, and he was involved in the OSCE. They have observers, peace observers. What would I say on billboards? I mean, I think the billboards ought to be put up opposite the White House and probably in Ben Gurion Airport. Those are the places where you need to put up the billboards, or outside the headquarters of one of the big, arms companies. I'm trying to think of which is the worst. I don't know. The ones who make missiles and fighter bombers and so on. And the billboards would say, weapons kill and have mercy and thou shalt not kill. I'm not religious, but I think that's a very good rule. Or actually, my late ex-husband's saying, which I couldn't agree with more, which is that war is the total failure of the human spirit. Is that a bit long for a billboard, or do you think that would work?
It's a bit long for a billboard, but however, look, you've been to Belgrade, you've been to Baghdad, but you've never been to Ballincarrigy. You might come down someday and we could switch off the phone and we could talk about all these things and look at
that. Sounds lovely. I'd like that.
And look at the cattle and you have a cup of tea. Do you have tea over there? Fine Gael tea, we call it, Barry's tea. We have a cup of Barry's tea as well. Lara Marlowe, we're indebted to you and we thank you so much. I'm now going to hand over to Ian, please. Okay, thank you, Lara. Ian has some response.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks, Lara, for your great insights, personal insights based on your long and valuable experience as a journalist. Yes, this talk of billboards reminds me of the campaign by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. I think it was in the early 70s where they did put up billboards globally, I think, in New York City and elsewhere, capital cities all over the world, saying war is over if you want it. John Lennon's optimistic slogan. If only that was the case 50 years on, and we're seeing that it isn't over, unfortunately. But I think for me, really the impressive aspect of what you were sharing with us this evening does come from your direct personal experience as a journalist and your very graphic account of the direct human consequences of war, in terms of lives lost, civilians slaughtered by bombardment, in all the different countries that you mentioned, about the impact of depleted uranium in Iraq, the very real, immediate, disastrous human consequences of war that we've seen in all of these different countries. And then again, as you've mentioned, the longer term impact of war and this focus on military responses to conflict. Again, the countries that you worked in, Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, former Yugoslavia, as you said, none of them are doing terribly well. And we can say that this really is a direct result of the consequences of war, military conflict, this connection to, as you put it, the war machine. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves, well, we're all aware of peace activists, of the power of the war machine. I mean, one example that you talked about, again, quite clearly and quite articulately, is the Israeli capacity for Hasbara, I think is the term they use to describe their very effective propaganda machine to defend the atrocities that they've perpetrated against Palestinians now over many decades. So that's one element of the war machine, of course. And again, this, as I suppose as pessimistic as we might be sometimes, or as half full our glasses might seem sometimes, again, for me, it does suggest the importance of the work of groups like World Beyond War and other peace groups, both within particular countries, but also those that have a global reach, to resist the war machine. I mean, not just to respond to individual wars. Of course, humanitarian aid is important, direct aid to civilians and the civilians who are suffering as a result of war, but also to dismantle the war machine through challenging its different aspects. The political aspects, the defense ministries, how they're interlinked with arms corporations and the arms trade, those who are benefiting from war. We know the destructive consequences, but of course the war machine is there because others are benefiting from this machine. So the importance of resistance, you were fairly benign, I think, perhaps in your view. I mean, Stop Swords to Plowshares was mentioned, and this is a recently formed network of peace activists across Ireland, both north and south, and it was formed within the last year or so precisely because of concern about increasing involvement by Ireland in the war machine, arms production, the arms trade. We have the example of the Tally's factory in Belfast, for instance. And then most recently, in November, the Irish government, the Ministry of Defence in the Republic, hosted this seminar on facilitating access by Irish companies to European defence funds to further implicate Ireland in the war machine. So, we do have our work cut out for us, but I think with the benefit of insights like yours and the excellent journalism that you provide, this really provides us with some excellent resources to continue our campaigns. So thank you very much. And those are just a few reactions that I had to what you had.
Thank you, Ian. Can I say a few words?
That's over to Brian, I guess, but yes.
Yes.
No, I just want to say I have immense admiration for people who campaign, who join groups like yours. If I were going to be part of one, it would probably be the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. I don't know what they're doing anymore. They've been around forever. I think they were founded by Bertrand Russell, but also the human rights groups. I have immense admiration for Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, especially Beit Silim in Israel, which is really at the root of a lot of the reporting that is done about the violations of Palestinian rights. They're very, very brave, and they have a very hard time. Anyway, keep up the good work. Sorry for interrupting. Miriam.
I think so to Caroline for questions now. So thanks, Caroline.
Okie doke. And thanks very much, everybody, especially to Lara, which has just been, you know, very kind of moving, really, and a uniquely real, you know, telling of what war is like. But as somebody said earlier, I live in an eco-village, and I suppose just to start the questions rolling, I would like to know what your impressions are of the impact of war on nature, and especially given, you know, talk about climate change now and the Stop Ecocide campaigns and kind of rights to nature law and everything that's been talked about, and still war is going on. So I'm sure you have, you know, a few observations on that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, war is obviously extremely destructive to nature. I mean, I've seen so many landscapes that were just destroyed, just you know, fires burning, the pollution from the weapons lasts obviously for generations. I know one thing that always upset me in the wars that I covered were the animals. And I don't think I ever really wrote about it, because when obviously destroying a human life is the worst crime. And so one rarely talks about nature and animals, but though they are also casualties of war. You're absolutely right. And I remember in particular during bombardments in southern Lebanon, the villagers often would flee, and they would have to abandon their animals, and you would drive at great speed through these villages under bombardment, and there would be dogs and cats wailing or limping around, or obviously starving, you know, their bones sticking out. And that was really, really upsetting. And also I remember the wires from the TOW missiles. I actually tell in the book a story of how our cat swallowed one of these wires that Robert had left on his desk. But the vet said that this wire was, I think it was copper, but if we hadn't got it out of the cat very quickly, she would have died, because it was poisonous. So all of the weapons are poisonous, and they're poisoning the land, the water supply very often as well.
Absolutely. And even in Ireland, we had the case of Russian exercises going on in the sea just recently, and there was a concern by the Irish Whale and Dolphin Association that the sonar would eventually, you know, after a few weeks, the Russians would be gone and everything, or whoever, because actually it's loads of international Marines would be out there doing that. So now I'll have a look at a few other questions here. I think we had one there from, let's see, sorry. Somebody actually mentioned, well, I think you've kind of covered it already, Israel. Oh, well, yeah, and well, sorry. Oh, well, no, I'll take Ed's question here, sorry, first. Putin is now being accused with some justification of breaching international laws. And what are your views on the US and NATO breaches of international law in their wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and supporting wars in Yemen and elsewhere? So.
Well, I think people should obey international law, obviously. Yes, Putin has broken international laws by sending soldiers into Donbass, by recognizing these so-called popular republics and so on. Although it's interesting, there really is a double standard, and I don't want to give Putin any credit in any way, but he always goes back to Kosovo. And when Kosovo wanted independence from Belgrade, it was self-determination. And when his sort of quislings in Donbass or Abkhazia and South Ossetia and whatever these places wanted, it's no longer self-determination. It's, you know, breakaway separatists and rebels and this sort of thing. So it's, you know, one man's, it's like terrorism, you know, the way you use the term depends on whose side you're on, basically. International law, well, there are laws of war. It's called the Geneva Convention. And it says, for example, that you must look after the people in occupied territories. I seem to remember the Israelis would not provide COVID vaccinations for the Palestinians whose land they occupy, which under the Geneva Convention they should do. Under the Geneva Convention, you don't hold people without trial or due process. There are, the last time I looked, I think it was 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons, the vast majority of them without due process, without being charged or anything. That's the US, yes, Afghanistan. I mean, one of the most powerful stories that really struck me, because it resembled so much a story that Robert and I had covered, was, I think it was after the US pulled out of Kabul, I believe on August 15th last year, if my memory is correct. And a few days later, they fired, a drone fired a missile at a car in a sort of enclosed area, like a parking area of a house in Kabul. And they killed a middle-aged man who actually turned out to be working for an NGO. He was an aid worker. And they killed, if my memory is correct, 7 children with him. And for initially, the Americans claimed he was a terrorist, and as they usually do, they thought that he was plotting. There had been those bombs at the airport. You remember the bombs that killed a lot of people, dozens of people at Kabul airport. And the Americans said there was going to be more of this. And it was just sloppiness. You know, they didn't have, they'd seen this guy driving around Kabul and thought he looked suspicious. And so they killed him. I mean, that I would think is definitely a violation of international law. Where do you start? Where do you start? I mean, I've seen hospitals bombed, ambulances bombed in Lebanon, in Iraq. I've seen, you know, I mean, the Amaria shelter, those 400 people who died just incinerated. No, I don't think there's any war that is according to the Geneva Conventions or according to international law. The only war that I ever covered that could even be conceived to be legal was the 1991 war, because they got a UN resolution saying that they could go to war. But the 1999 Belgrade War was illegal. The 2003 Iraq War was illegal in every sense of the word.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I just get in one last little question, which is about journalism. And do you think that it does have a role in building peace? Or, I mean, it also seems to have a role in you know, in kind of reinforcing war. But just a quick opinion on that, if you wouldn't mind.
I think it's essential. Whether ultimately it does any good, I'm not so sure. I doubt that anything I've written ever really changed anything. I think Robert Fisk's work did change things, because he changed the perception of Israel and support for Israel in the UK. I think you have to keep struggling and you keep fighting. I think also there are journalists who cheerlead for wars. Fox News comes to mind, and there's a lot of disinformation. I'm as conscientious as I can be about verifying everything I write, and I want to make sure that I really think it's true. I mean, I wouldn't write anything if I didn't think it was true, and always try to look at it from the other side. You know, why is this official telling me this? Is this disinformation? Am I being manipulated? You really got to have your wits about you. You've got to try. I don't think that, you know, it's a fine line between being a crusading journalist I don't believe in objectivity. I don't believe that wire agency journalism. I mean, for many, many years, people said you should just tell the facts, only the facts, nothing but the facts. And to some extent that's true, but if you don't convey what you think is actually happening, what is motivating people, what their ulterior motives are, and I think sometimes things have to be denounced. You have to do that. And
Thank you.
I think public opinion makes a difference. If you can affect public opinion and the public put pressure on their leaders, that's the way to go at it. Then you've accomplished something if you can do that.
Mm-hmm. Because really, when we look back, I think it's journalism like yours that sometimes has been the only thing that has made a difference. You know, it has actually made all the difference. So thank you very much. And I think I'll just head over to Miriam. Is it Miriam?
Yeah. Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Caroline, very much. We seem to be living through some kind of pandemic of manufactured wars. But I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us this evening. And I hope next Wednesday you can join us again when Heather King will be in conversation with Malala Joya. She's a peace activist and parliamentarian from Afghanistan. And our correspondent will be Mary McDermott, who's CEO of Safe Ireland. So Barry, I think, is going to put up a Jack B. Yates painting now. So I leave you now with the image of Jack Butler Yates' painting, and it's called Grief. And this painting is Yates' most powerful expression of his absolute abhorrence of war. And it originates from a sketch entitled, "Let There Be No More War." And in the foreground, an elderly man is seen, and he looks at the blood that drops from his hands, while a mother places her arm protectively around a small child. And this was an exhibition of Jack Butler Yates' work, and it was in the National Gallery in Dublin recently. It has just finished, and it was on the 150th anniversary of Jack Butler Yates' birth. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and you can ponder the painting at the moment. Thank you all again.
Thank you. It's an amazing painting.
Thank
Thanks,
you, everyone.
You've been a great audience. It was a pleasure.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye now.